You are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt är livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Lisa Åsimäki. Today I'm welcoming Professor Susie Garvis to the program. She is an international researcher. She's also the department chair for the School of Education at Swinburne University here in Melbourne, Australia. She has extensive teaching and leadership experience in early childhood education and teacher education in higher education in Australia as well as Sweden. She was previously a professor at the University of Gothenburg or Göteborg in Sweden, as well as a guest professor at Stockholm University. Today she will be sharing with us about balancing parenthood with the demands of her work, as well as some of her experiences from working in Sweden. So, hello Susie, and how are you this morning?
I'm wonderful, Lisa, and it's a beautiful day in Melbourne with 4 seasons in one day.
Yes, that is Melbourne for you.
It is. So I'm so excited to be able to talk around early childhood education and care today. It's such a wonderful area to be in for research, but also to understand it from a societal level as well.
Absolutely. And considering you have extensive international experience as a researcher in early childhood education and care, so I'm curious, why is understanding early childhood teaching and learning important?
Yeah, it's always an interesting question of why are we actually focusing on young children? And we know from a number of studies that, especially for brain research, this is the most important time in a child's life. And not only beyond the brain research, there's a lot of benefits for children to actually participate in early childhood education and care for future health, societal and education outcomes. So we know that if we get it right in early childhood, children, as they progress through their learning trajectories, will be strong contributors to society as well.
Mm-hmm. So what were your reasons? Why were you drawn to early childhood in the first place?
Ooh, I think it's probably from a curiosity of how children learn, how they develop, but also how we can really support them to ensure that they have positive trajectories as well.
Right. Now, you did your PhD in Australia.
Yes.
But you also have experience working as a professor in Sweden and at the two most prestigious universities in Gothenburg or Göteborg and Stockholm. Can you share your thoughts about some of the differences and similarities between Sweden and Australia in relation to early childhood teaching and learning in higher education?
Yeah, so I think with similarities, it's always important that early childhood teacher education is at a university. So that's a strong similarity between Sweden and Australia, where it's actually given the respect that it is part of initial teacher education. I think one of the biggest differences is that in Sweden, the students in early childhood will also undertake an uppsats or a thesis, whereas that doesn't happen in Australian early childhood teacher education at all. And then there are also other differences where placement, for example, where there might be more team placements or group placements in Sweden where the students are actually going out in paired placements. Mm-hmm. And again, you wouldn't see that in an Australian context either. But we do know the benefits from having paired placements as well.
So what are the benefits?
Yeah, so the benefits of paired placements is basically the students are able to learn together, they're able to collaborate with each other, and then work with their supervisor as well. So it's about them being able to engage in a community of practice together and also extending and supporting each other as they scaffold each other in that placement.
And so why do you think it's important with the actual essay at the end of the 3-year? Is it 3-year teaching degree, early childhood teaching degree, or is it 4 years in Sweden?
So in Sweden, it is 3.5, 4 years. So that UPSATS is done and then they will come back for a few more other units. In Australia, depending on the state or territory, it's a 3-year program or a 4-year program, depending on the registration body. But the importance of the UPSATS is that it allows students to really develop skills around research, know how to use data, and actually allows the students to engage in that very much that reflective practice of what you're wanting in early childhood education.
And also the fact that you are actually applying research, understanding the importance of research when you apply to your work.
Absolutely. And it's a long-term skill that needs to start and develop from the beginning of when you become a teacher. And so what a wonderful time for it to actually start to happen during teacher education.
Okay. Now, you lived in Sweden for a few years, and particularly in Gothenburg or Gothenburg, and your daughter was born in Sweden. Now, I'm curious about finding out, what was it like for you to be pregnant in Sweden?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, actually, especially by Australian parents. And I guess the biggest difference is that in Sweden, it's not overly medicalized like it would be in an Australian context. So I saw my midwife for the whole time. I never came in contact with a doctor. And it was just lovely to go to these midwife visits. One of the biggest differences, I think, was the amount of not screening, but the amount of medicalization that happens in Australia, where you wouldn't be with the midwife, you would be with an obstetrician. Sometimes you could be with a midwife, but again, it just depends. But this idea that it's more of a medical process rather than a natural process. Interestingly, in Australia, children, there's a higher incidence of cesareans and children who are actually coming to term with cesareans between the 36 to the 39-week mark. In Sweden, one of the biggest differences is, especially as a first-time mum, is that they will allow you to go over the 40-week mark for pregnancy. They want it to be a natural experience where you could go up to 42 weeks before there would be some type of inducement.
Really?
Yep. Well, I think it's more of just acknowledging that it's a natural process. So the 40 weeks of pregnancy, that's always done on averages as well. So it really acknowledges that children will come when they're ready.
Yeah.
And the idea is that then, for some children, this will take longer time, shorter time, etc., but to allow that natural process to happen.
So after the birth of your daughter, how important was the paid parental leave offered to you as well as to your husband? How did it work?
The paid parental leave is amazing in the Nordic countries, especially in Sweden, where you can share the parental leave, and it provides the opportunity to spend at least the first year and a half at home with your child, or more, depending on how you're using it, up until your child is 4 years old.
Wow.
And the other real benefit is also VABA, or care for your child, where if your child is sick, you can actually take a VABA day to look after your child as well. And that's something that's not in the Australian system. Policies are nowhere near as family friendly to families in the workplace. And so in the Australian context, you would either have to take a day of unpaid leave, or if you're lucky, your employer may have a small number of days from your personal care leave you could use for a sick child.
So, and this thing about sharing the parental leave, and it's not called maternity leave, it's called parental leave, which allows then the father being part of that, sharing the work, sharing the child's first year. Did your husband take up on that?
Yes, absolutely. And we know from the research as well, there's a lot of long-term benefits from sharing paid parental leave, not only for the parents themselves, but also for the child. So we know from some of the research that parents interact differently with children. Some of the research says that children who have time of paid parental leave with the father, they actually engage in a lot more risky play, sometimes more physical play as well, because it's just a different way of playing with or interacting with the child.
Right. And so did you find, did your daughter then attend preschool or, kindergarten? You don't find care for under 1-year-olds?
That's right. No, so your child has to be at least one before they start. So my daughter went to Forskula. She started when she was about 13 months old, part-time. And the fantastic experience was around in-schooling, where it's the primary attachment transfer from the parent to the carer.
Yeah.
And this can take a short time, a long time, depending on the needs of the child, but it's a flexible relationship, and it's the understanding as well that for some children it'll take a little while, other children a little bit longer, but it's also supported by government policy where parental leave, or there's leave entitlements as well for the in-schooling process.
And of course, Sweden has got a great deal of child protection policies, and especially the one that came, was it in 2018, the child's rights or children's right, which was the United Nations policy about the child's right that then was that became policy in Sweden. What do you think of chances of something like that being implemented here in Australia?
It would be possible, but it would also create a restructure or reconceptualization of children in society as well. So part of it is children have a right to education, a right to a number of different elements within the legalization of the CRC, or the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Absolutely, it's what we should be working towards, but it would mean changes, quite a number of structural changes would need to occur in Australia, even things around universal access, for example, allowing all children to participate. In Sweden, that would mean that children have access to food, for example, when they're in early childhood or school. Textbooks cannot be charged for, excursions cannot be charged for. So these types of structural elements as well would have to be reconsidered or reconfigured.
And do you think there would be support for something like this in Australia?
I think there would be support. I think, though, there would be the question of how much will have to be spent for long-term gain. But as we can see from the Swedish model, there's a lot to be gained from early prevention.
Yeah, sure. Now, during the time that you were pregnant, you continued working, and you were actually writing an interesting chapter on digital narratives and young children. Can you share briefly why you wrote the chapter and what the chapter is about?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to think about what children are capable of with digital technology. And there's a lot of deficit thinking out there that children shouldn't engage with technology, it's bad for their health. So this particular chapter was to show what young children can actually do in through their everyday play and story making with digital technology, and also to have a little bit of pushback against that deficit behaviour. Children will engage with technology because it's part of their world or their life now. So it's looking at how it can be supported and how we can actually find really productive ways for children to engage with it.
It's an interesting chapter that really worthwhile worth reading. Now, considering you wrote the chapter in 2018, now a great deal has of course happened since. You left Sweden in 2020 to take on the position as chair of the School of Education at the Swinburne University of Technology here in Melbourne, and this was just as COVID-19 was happening. And today, March 2022, or the final day in March 2022, the incredible harsh restrictions that Melbourne in particular have experienced have now been lifted. But I'm especially curious about your thoughts about the effect of the pandemic and its restrictions on young children's learning, and what do we need to do today to catch up, if it is at all possible?
Yeah, I think this is a big question where we need to be thinking about is what is best for the child at the moment. And unfortunately, I don't think there's enough focus in Australia around how we can actually support children after or even now as the pandemic continues. Melbourne was the most locked down city, and to give people some context as well, there were some lockdowns where children were not allowed to go. Well, most of the lockdowns, children were not allowed to go to school. It was remote learning. Playgrounds were closed. There were limits of an hour to 2 hours for how long people could actually be outside. There were limits on where you could travel to. Face mask rules for outside, etc. So there was a lot of changes that were happening all of a sudden, and it has actually influenced children's learning. So I think one of the biggest things, first of all, is around thinking of how we can actually support children in this new space. And you'll notice that children's plays actually change quite a bit, especially when children haven't had access to outdoor playgrounds or outdoor activities. But also children's plays change in regards to bringing in a lot of the elements that they're experiencing. So QR codes for check-ins, face masks, thinking about even what does it mean to protect yourself in the pandemic. And so it's had a lot of effect, I think, on children's learning. And even the ability for socialization, a lot of the skills that children would be developing, because children have been at home, it's about re-engaging and those skills starting to be supported again back in early childhood settings. I think one of the interesting things from the pandemic is that we're only now starting to see some of the impacts in development, especially in the research. But some of the stories that you hear from community groups that I work with are just absolutely heartbreaking. So, for example, when there were shops closed, a lot of industries closed in the hard lockdowns in Melbourne, especially if parents didn't have employment that they would go to, in some communities, the older children would have to drop out of school or drop out of the online remote learning to actually go and work to support the family. So it's almost the sacrifice of education just to keep on top of bills and things like that. And now even with living costs going up in Australia, I'm starting to hear similar rhetorics from community organisations that I work with as well.
And what do you think is the impact on parents? I mean, that would have been very, very challenging for both parents, I would imagine.
Absolutely. And there's always the isolation rules that keep changing. So if a child has COVID, there's then a number of transitions or changes that the family will have to go through continuously. So during the hard lockdowns, families were expected to educate the child or look after the child at the same time as work, which is really, really tough. And even now, there's a lot of not a lot of support for families, I would say, where this type of continuously juggling and trying to trying to balance everything for families, it's really difficult. So if a child's class might go down where they might all have to isolate. Some schools now are still going in and out of remote learning because of lack of staff. And again, for families, for parents as well who might be working, it's that pivot where they all of a sudden they may not be able to go to the office, have to go back to working from home again. And it's just a continuous place. So it's very stressful for families.
In what ways do you think the pandemic has changed you in your role as a parent, as a partner, researcher, and educator?
Yeah, as a parent, I would say it's about being more compassionate and learning that we can control a little bit, but not everything, and being happy with what we can control, but also accepting that flexibility will be there. But as I always tell myself, is that storms don't last forever. So the pandemic isn't going to go on forever. It's just at this point in time as well. And I think as well, in regards to being a partner, again, it's around that flexibility, but having to work together to get through the situation. Researcher, it's been tough because we haven't been able to continue with research plans. We've had to pivot. We've had to change our thinking. There has been suspension on research in early childhood in schools. So again, it's just this continuous pivoting that's going on. Then lastly, as an educator, it's around being flexible because, again, there's been a number of changes there at the university. And I guess the thing is that with flexibility also comes fatigue. So it's really important amongst this to think about self-care, your own health and well-being, but also starting to think of it's the small things. It's the small things that really help people get through the day.
You know, I wanted to ask you, now you were working in Sweden. What are the similarity and the differences working as an academic or in your role as a professor here in Australia to what it was like in Sweden?
Yeah, I think this is a good question around the differences. So first of all, a good thing about being in Sweden is that you actually have access to European research funding, but also Swedish Nordic research funding. And I think there's a lot more respect for educational sciences. Whereas in Australia, there's a lot of negative discourse around education and teacher education in particular, which also then extends to opportunities for funding and research. Another difference is probably around the actual support structures that are there. But again, this is dependent on my experience, where in a Swedish context, there are administrators sometimes that you wouldn't see that same level of administration in some Australian contexts.
Is that bad or good?
It could be both. It just depends, I think, on the level of support and what the intention is as well. I think the problem at the moment in Australia is that because of COVID and increases in costs of living, and just a change in the financial situation at a lot of universities, it then means that funding for research or professional learning, there's not as much as what there has been previously.
And thinking about teacher education here in Australia now, there is a teacher education review that is happening. And I'm particularly interested in what you think about teacher education programs for early childhood teachers here in Australia. Do you think programs here support or provide easy early childhood teachers with the necessary digital learning skills to support all young children in their learning?
That's a very deep philosophical question. I think it's good to have high standards. We never want to compromise on standards because of supply. And what I mean by that is the focus shouldn't be on having a teacher in an early childhood setting. The focus should be on having a quality early childhood teacher in the setting. And what I think is important is to consider what skill levels can be taught in teacher education, but also what needs to happen in professional learning to continue learning as an ongoing professional skill to have. And so it's around not only the teacher education dialogue, but also the supports with mentors, long-term professional learning, access to professional learning activities to continue this type of knowledge and skill development.
You know, when you talk about quality, what do you mean by quality?
Yeah, so quality is to ensure that we have high standards so that we know that educators are achieving and working with children and families to a high standard. They understand the importance of different pedagogies to support children, the importance of interactions, even factors such as how to talk to children in scaffold language, having fine balances between play, intentional teaching, also around understanding routines, transitions. And it's having that, not only the knowledge of it, but also being able to implement it as well.
Do you think in Sweden it's more play-based than it is here in Australia?
Absolutely. It's more play-based and there's a lot more time outside as well for children.
Okay. So why do you think that we don't have children here in Australia spending more time outside?
Yeah, I think it's to do with how we class outside as well. So in a Swedish context, outside could be taking the children to the forest for a walk around the neighbourhood, into the society that they're actually a part of. In the Australian context, the child may have access to an outside play environment in an early childhood setting, but it's unlikely that they're actually experiencing the bigger outside of the fence.
Wow. Life in Australia. Susie, do you have anything you want to add that you are especially concerned about here in Australia, or that you consider of great importance to bring up? Perhaps something that you remember from your time in Sweden that you think, oh, that's definitely what needs to be brought here to Australia.
Absolutely. And in regards to early childhood, I think we shouldn't let me rephrase that. In the Australian context, imagine if all children had access in early childhood to breakfast, morning tea, lunch and afternoon tea. And imagine if childcare fees were very low for parents. So parents could participate in the workforce, children could participate in early childhood services. By allowing access, equality and affordability, it would make a huge difference to Australian children and also Australian families, but also the economy as well. So it's thinking around long-term economic policies and supports, but also thinking about what's actually needed for prevention.
And you know, you're actually bringing up the most important. I mean, I understand we are talking about families, we're talking about parents, but this is also very much a women's issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's around allowing women to participate in the workforce, and it's also allowing access equality for all children where it's not dependent on their background.
And that now you're touching on inclusion.
Yep. So we need everyone to be included. We know what policies can do this. It's just making sure that it's actually implemented and funded.
Susie, one final question. Why is it so hard to provide inclusive education?
So inclusion, it depends on how it's actually described and understood within society. And it's really important to think about what's valued. The Swedish context of education for all makes it very clear around what education should be. All children have the right to education. And imagine what would be actually possible if there was such a common understanding and support for that philosophy as well to be implemented in an Australian context.
Susie, thank you so much for your time this morning, and it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa, and have a great day.
And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt är livet i Sverige, or in English, That's Life here in Sweden, with me, Lisa Åsimäki. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.